We are excited, we are delighted, we are honored to host Chimamanda Adichie tonight. She'll be talking about her new book. It's called Dear Ijeawele, I think I pronounced that sort of close, or a feminist manifesto in 15 suggestions. Those of you who already have picked up your copies will notice that it's a beautiful little book. It's a very slender volume, it's only 63 pages, but do not be fooled by its size. As the title suggests, it's a manifesto, and once you read it, you'll realize that rarely does such a small package emit such a powerful blast of moral clarity. For those of you who are here and somehow don't know anything about our author, let me give you a brief summary. Chimamanda Adichie is, simply put, one of the most compelling contemporary literary voices in the world today, having written superb novels, masterful collection of short stories, and works for the New Yorker, Granta, and other leading publications. She has won more literary prizes than I could list. She's been named a MacArthur Fellow. It is no accident that her books have been translated into 30 languages. Along with her fiction, she has spoken out about and written about gender roles, gender politics, and gender dynamics in Nigeria, where she was born and still spends part of her time, and in the United States, where she studied, teaches, and resides for part of the year. But mostly, she's explored gender and feminism as a universal proposition, as part of our broader common humanity. Could there be a more important time than right now for a book about how to raise our daughters, and by extension our sons, to believe that girls and boys matter equally? We need only look at the 2016 presidential election, among many other distressing and perhaps less obvious and visible examples, to know the answer to that question. So my advice in these rather troubling times is, please read Chimamanda's new book. And how about all of her books, for that matter, and give copies to everyone you know. She has long cautioned her audiences to beware of the danger of a single story, the reliance on a narrow and incomplete narrative about a people or a place. With this little book, and again, with all of her works really, she helps us move beyond a single story about women and about men too. And in this way, she's inspiring us to do our part in her work to create a fairer and happier world for women and for men, for our daughters and for our sons. We're also truly delighted and grateful to have with us tonight another wonderful woman whose voice will be familiar to anyone who listens to NPR. Audie Cornish is co-host of All Things Considered. She will be in conversation with Chimamanda. Audie's radio audiences know her as a journalist with extensive experience covering American politics and culture, and also as a talented and wide-ranging interviewer. We thank you both for being here. Please join me in welcoming Chimamanda Adichie.
After the reading of the bios, I had a nice humbling moment there, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm just also here. Excited to be here. It's good to see you all, especially since you didn't look like I thought you would, so it's an unexpected moment for me. So, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, thank you so much for sitting down and speaking with us.
Thank you.
Now, we're doing this in part because sold out crowd, but also because we spoke on All Things Considered a few weeks ago. And a lot of things end up on the cutting room floor, like quite literally. That always breaks my heart, because I'm like, oh, I had this amazing conversation with this beautiful person, and then we aired 6 minutes of it. So this is going to be the uncut, director's cut version, I think, of the conversation. And since we spoke, you've been on tour. You've been asked a lot of questions about this book. And just one thing to get out of the gate, I know that when I first picked it up, I saw Manifesto, and I was like, hard pass. So did you have any reluctance
Manifesto in a playful way. It's sort of me making fun of it a little, because I realize that it's a very loaded, heavy word, and I realize that people for whom it will be a reason to say, I don't think so. Right? But, but let's see how that goes. And no, I didn't.
It's working out. I mean, I'm not saying that other people have done this, but it reminded me to check my own biases, right? And the idea of like, oh, here's all the baggage that comes with things that when we see the word feminist, like, what does that mean? And here's all my thoughts about it. And I had to say to myself, like, well, wait a second, why do you feel that way?
Right. So it's not just Manifesto, it's feminist before it. So that's like double scary.
Yeah.
But I like to think that the 15 suggestions, this, kind of lightens things up a little. But
just because the length, the number, it's like, it's just like a women's magazine cover, just throw a number on there.
15
yeah, it's
But so no, actually, I think if anything, I think maybe some of my publishers were not so sure about the manifesto, but I wanted it there because in some ways it is a manifesto for me, because it's a letter to a friend, but it's also it made me think in concrete ways about my own feminist thinking. And so in a way it's a map for me, and I hope that it's a map that other people find it useful as a map.
I think once you become a person in the public mind who really is willing to be a public intellectual and talk about these ideas, you get asked about a lot of things. And on this tour, I know early in, you've been asked about kind of how this conversation fits into the gender spectrum and how people talk about gender roles and gender fluidity. And I want to address something early in this conversation because you've written about it since. You were asked in an interview about the role of trans women in the feminist movement. And you essentially were criticized for saying that people should not conflate the gender experiences of trans women with that of women born female. And since then you've apologized and also tried to write some clarification about that. How did you end up clarifying this in the end? How did you find your way towards what your thinking is?
I think I want to start by saying I didn't apologize because I don't think I have anything to apologize for. I had said that I think that trans women experience gender in a way that's different from women born female. And there was a lot of pushback and a lot of unkindness, to put it mildly. And I mean, it wasn't pleasant, and I think it wasn't pleasant not because of sort of criticism and vitriol and hostility, which I'm used to, because I think if you make the choice to label yourself feminist publicly, it just comes with the baggage. But in this case, it came from my tribe. And so in this case, my tribe being, women who believe in equality. And so that was a bit unpleasant and difficult. But really, my position remains that I think gender is about what we experience. Gender is about how the world treats us. And I think a lot of the outrage and the anger comes from the idea that in order to be inclusive, we sometimes have to deny difference. I think that because human difference for so long, in all of its various forms, has been the root of so much oppression, sometimes there's the impulse to say, let's deny the difference, as though by wishing away the difference, we can then wish away the oppression. And I think in some ways it's similar to the idea of colorblindness. And I'm sorry I'm digressing to race, but because I'm both black and a woman, and I don't choose when I'm black and when I'm a woman, so, but in some ways it's like the idea of colorblindness, which I think is just a really hollow idea that if we say we don't see color, then somehow all of the oppressions linked to color will disappear, but that's not the case. And so I think in this particular case, I come from a world, for example, and I think this is true for everyone in the world, really, that a child is born, and you look at the organ between the child's legs, and there's an automatic value or not given to that child. In certain parts of the world, it means that child will be killed. Baby girls are still killed in many parts of the world because they are baby girls. I come from a culture where a little boy has the prestigious role of breaking the kola knot in Igbo tradition. the kola nut is ceremonial, but it's also prestigious, and only boys can break the kola nut. And it doesn't matter how old the child is, as long as it's a male. So if you have a gathering of adult women who are about to have a party or something, and the kola nut has to be broken before, you have to find a child who's a boy to do it. The point being that these are all subtle privileges that society confers on people because they are male. I think that if you're raised in a world like that, it's not even so much about, sometimes I think that there are people who felt that I was somehow saying, I was somehow making a point about oppression Olympics, you haven't suffered enough, or you've suffered, and it's not at all that. It's simply to say that if we can acknowledge that there are differences, then we can better honestly talk about things. And it's not even just, we can talking about reproductive rights, which I think is a central issue for women. Talking about same-sex schools. So if we're having a conversation about same-sex schools, if we refuse to acknowledge the differences in how trans women and women-born female experience gender, then we can't really have an honest conversation of what it means to have same-sex schools, and whether in fact our society needs same-sex schools, right? So there's a sense in which, for me, feminism should broaden and widen understandings of gender, and to insist that there are no differences. What we are doing instead is we're narrowing. And I just don't believe that we have to insist in the name of being inclusive on the idea that everything is the same, because it's simply not true.
So how has this made you think differently, or what insight has it given you into the idea of intersectionality? Because I think for some people, if they hear you talk and they still feel unsatisfied by your answer, they think the same way someone else might think about how someone who's talking about being colorblind or race, that like, this person isn't quite getting why my experience is of value to this movement.
But it's not, but that's the point. I haven't said that the experience of trans women is not of value. It is. But that's the whole point. It widens and broadens the feminist discourse. And that's a good thing. But the only way it can do that is if we acknowledge the differences. Otherwise, what's interesting to me is that this is also in many ways about language. Because it seems to me that, and in some ways I think it also illustrates the less pleasant aspects of the American left, that there sometimes is a kind of language orthodoxy that you're supposed to participate in. And when you don't, there's a kind of backlash that gets very personal and very, very hostile and sort of very close to debate. So it's not at all that I'm suggesting that, and I'm a person who has always stood up for the rights of trans women and will continue to do so. And not because of the oppression and the violence, but because they're human beings who are fully deserving to be who they are. And I think that, of course, they are part of feminism, and it widens the debate. But I think it then becomes a bit, I just find it to be disingenuous to say that there are no differences. Right? That's really what my point is, that we have to be able to acknowledge differences and be supportive. And that acknowledging the difference doesn't somehow mean saying that one experience is more valid or more important than the other, because that's also not true. Right? That feminism has to have room, and does have room, for many different experiences of gender. For me, I think our world would be a better place if we didn't have a strict gender binary. If there was sort of more of a continuum, really. If there were many more voices and many more experiences, and then, because in some ways the very strict binary reinforces ideas of oppression.
So this gets me to a question I have about the book, because one of the suggestions, I'm skipping the early ones, which I think for this crowd, you guys are probably already into, about being a full person and doing the parenting jointly. I hope so. Do we feel like we can? We're going to go past Chimamanda 101, okay? We're just going to go to 105 right now. And the idea of teaching language, because you talk about this in the book, about talking to your daughters and sons about language and how to understand language that's damaging. How do you not cross the line into the exact thing you're talking about, which is a kind of finger-wagging or policing of language that I think feminism in particular comes in for criticism for?
It's also why, there's an academic feminism, and that's not where I don't situate myself there, because I didn't start out, I didn't become a feminist because I read seminal feminist texts. I became a feminist because I watched and observed my world. And so because of that, my approach is less about a certain kind of language orthodoxy. I think, for example, that, and the reason that to go back to saying that my insisting on acknowledging the difference is in the end about language, because had I said a cis woman is a cis woman and a trans woman is a trans woman, I don't think I would get all of the crap that I'm getting. But that's actually really what I was saying. But because cis is not a part of my vocabulary, it just isn't. And so, it really becomes about language. And the reason I find that troubling is that to insist that you have to speak in a certain way and use certain expressions, otherwise we cannot have a conversation, can close off debate. And if we can't have conversations, then we can't have progress. And so, which is why one of the suggestions in the book is for the mother not to use too much jargon, because the vast parts of the world where people don't even know what the hell feminist is.
Right. Your example was misogyny.
Yeah.
Like, don't look at your 3-year-old and be like, misogynist. We're gonna wait on that.
And I try not to do that, especially with young people. So instead of sort of saying to them, patriarchy and misogyny, I use story, I use examples. Because I think when you reduce things to the level of story, the level of just human beings, it's clearer, it's more universal, it's more inclusive, it's less alienating, and it becomes, because for me, I like to say, well, what's the point of feminism? Is the point to be in an exclusive party where we get to decide self-righteously who gets to come and who doesn't, or is the point to change the world? For me, the point is to change the world.
That's a threshold you could probably apply to any movement, right? Like at some point, when the rubber hits the road, you look around the room and you're like, is it about more than the people in this room?
Yeah. And I think that if it is to change the world, then there's a sense in which it cannot, it has to go down. It has to go down. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in ways, I'm interested in the market woman in my ancestral hometown. I'm interested in what she thinks about her place in the world. I'm interested in the woman here in the US who has been told over and over that a woman cannot have it all. I'm interested in what she makes of her place in the world and how she thinks that can change. That's what I'm interested in. And my focus is less on language. And so I don't really partake in that kind of language orthodoxy. And there's a part of me also that really resists it. So I resist to be co-opted into it.
Okay, this is going to lead me to another suggestion in the book, which is teach her not to worry about likability.
Yes.
I'm not saying you're unlikable in this moment. But I'm saying you fully have embraced the idea that, yeah, every once in a while you're going to say things that people don't like.
Yeah.
And that is going to be a place that always doesn't feel very good for you. But in the way you corrected me about issuing an apology, that's very hard for women to do. I don't even think I would have done it. If someone said you apologize, I'd be like, that is what I did. Just to make things go smoother, right? I mean, that's kind of our MO sometimes.
Yes.
So the place you took this in the book, though, is about teaching this with an eye towards the idea that eventually it's going to help them understand consent.
Yes.
And I want to talk about this because I actually think this is a pretty complex idea and something that we're all thinking about right now as we talk about sexual assault on campus, or just as we talked about like high-profile predators, so to speak, and what does consent look like. How do you feel? Am I not supposed to say that? I can say it. Hey. All right, this is NPR Crowd of 7 High-profile alleged predators. But how does it connect to consent? What is it about me learning at an early age to de-escalate, be nice, always let people like me, that becomes a problem later on?
Yeah. It's not about, I think, to be kind, to be civil, to be polite are all things that are wonderful for both boys and girls. And I was raised in an Igbo household where politeness was very important. So in many ways, I'm a well-brought-up Igbo girl with very polite manners when I remember. But there's a certain insidious thing that girls are taught very early on across cultures, which is that you change yourself to be likable. And when you do that, the world praises you. When you don't, you get labeled things like BITCH, CUNT, that kind of thing, right? What likability does to girls is that it makes them apologize when there's really no need to apologize. It makes them, in some ways, apologize for occupying their space in the world. It makes them apologetic in the way that they interact with the world. It makes them shrink themselves. It makes them have difficulty saying no. And so I've seen so many women go round and round. They really want to say no, but they're thinking it's going to make me unlikable. So it just gets into this thing where they can just say no. And the thing for me is doing all of those things, reducing yourself in order to get the world's approval, doesn't actually mean that people like you. They don't actually like you. They like that twisted up version of you, which isn't you. And so for me, I think the world is such a glorious, large, beautiful, diverse place that there is somebody who will like the real you. And I think it's important to teach girls this very early on because it's very hard to unlearn as an adult. If you've been told that over and over, you go to play groups and the little boys are sort of allowed to take the toys and do things. The little girls are told, put it back, be nice, come back. And that, it starts so early. And it worries me even more because it's dangerous for sexual assault. And it makes sexual assault even more dangerous than it already is. It makes it hard. There's so many girls who have been molested and they're still thinking about how to be nice to the people who've molested them. I have a friend in Lagos, for example, and she was complaining about her boss who had been harassing her, talking to her about, just sort of making comments about her breast and her body. And she was at my house and she had brought a friend, a guy, and she said, oh, I'm going to have to talk to my boss. I'm just done. I'm so uncomfortable and so unhappy. And this man said to her, yeah, you should, but the most important thing is you can't be rude. And my friend said, oh, I know, of course I won't be rude. And I remember being struck by that because here she is, she's been molested, well, she's been verbally assaulted, and she's uncomfortable, so she's being caused pain. But apparently, her primary preoccupation is how not to be rude to him. It's about likability.
Or is that about fear of retaliation?
No.
Right?
No.
Being
Because
in
if
a
it was-
power dynamic that doesn't allow for you to say something.
Because if it was, then she actually wouldn't even say anything. I mean, how she does it is not even as important as how she thinks of it. The idea that she's thinking about doing this and her preoccupation is, I can't be rude. If a man were complaining to his boss, his preoccupation would not be about not being rude. It's something that girls are taught. It's likability. And I think also that when it comes to saying no or saying yes, it then becomes complicated, right? Because sometimes when we talk about teaching girls about consent, I think it's important to teach them both how to say yes and how to say no. Because both are, and to take away the likability. I mean, to teach girls, don't think about whether he'll like you or not. Think about what's right for you. And it sounds obvious, but I see it all the time. And I think we just really need to take away that idea of likability. I think to be human is to want to be liked, which is lovely. Now, obviously, it's lovely to be liked, but we teach girls that they need to be liked, and that's what's problematic.
Now, you have a daughter, but for people who pick up this book and have sons, they also may want to find a way to have this conversation. I think just the idea of consent in general, like teaching that from a young age on, like as you've been out talking about this and getting questions from people, have people asked you that question, and do you have thoughts on how that conversation happens with young, is it cisgender men? Does it matter? We're just talking about consent. We don't want anyone being the aggressor. How do we talk to someone about being on the opposite side that consent question?
I think we have to step in. If I'd written this to a friend who had a boy, I think a number of the things would be the same, but obviously not everything. And the most important thing for me would be to start to challenge, to deconstruct, to break down the way we have constructed masculinity. And if we do that from early on, then actually that whole sort of being aggressive might not even, we might not need to have that conversation, because I think the idea of male, that whole idea of men will be men, and if a man is aggressive, we're told, oh, he's a man, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I mean, I think, what if we started teaching little boys to be ashamed of certain ideas of masculinity? And I've been thinking about shame as a tool, right? I think if you teach children that, for example, not showing emotion, for example, not being vulnerable is something to be ashamed of, and they grow up with that, what will it do? I mean, just thinking about that. But I think right now, to talk to people about being on the other side, they're linked though, because I mean, one of the things I have a big problem with is the way that women's bodies and women's sexualities are controlled in every society. In America, it's interesting because women in this country are expected to be sexy, but they're not expected to be sexual. So you go to the stores and the clothes are all tight and they have cutouts, but then if a woman talks about being a sexual being, they're sensual. And I think because of that, that's why, I think that's the kind of thinking, that kind of sort of moralistic, puritanical thinking that enables things like slut shaming. Because if this was not a society that controlled women's sexualities, then slut shaming would never happen. And if slut shaming didn't happen, then that idea of sort of aggression as part of a sexual act probably wouldn't be as central as it is in this country and everywhere in the world, really. I would want to say to people on the other side of this consent divide is just stop it.
Well, it made me think of another part of the book where you talk about kind of conditional kindness.
Yeah.
The idea like, well, be nice to her because she's a girl. Like, that's like the early lesson you get, right? Not because like kindness would be just probably a good thing that you should practice in general. Or the argument later on, the political argument, which I think we once heard in a national debate, which is, what if this happened to your wife, girlfriend, whoever? As in, it's not a value until the woman is related to you in some way.
Yeah. It's also conversations about rape, where instead of thinking about women as the full human beings that they are, we're often told, well, imagine if she were your daughter or your wife or your sister. Just thinking, I don't need to imagine the male victim of a crime as my brother or my father before I can feel empathy. So why is that always done when it's women? And there's a sense in which it's very mainstream, and I feel like things that are done over and over and are not questioned kind of become okay. So you hear this all the time, well, imagine if it was your sister. And I just find it to be dehumanizing to women.
And I did try it out in my brain with men, and it didn't work.
It doesn't work
because the news person, right? There's like a ton of horrible stories, and I was like, yeah, that would be very strange if I was like, oh well, that victim, what if he was my brother? Like that somehow that would be different for any.
We are still trying very hard to remind the world that women are fully equally human. I mean, that's fundamentally what it's about. And I think it's a shame that that's still happening.
Another lesson, which a spoiler alert, it happens towards the end, but this is a small book, so if you haven't read it by the time you came here, you've not done your homework. But towards the end of the book, there is one in particular, be careful not to turn the oppressed into saints, which in a way is sort of the pastime of parents, right? It's like every holiday, it's like, it's Martin Luther King Day. He was amazing and nothing ever went wrong. Like, the whole point of this thing is to have national leaders and activist heroes and to teach our children to revere those people, right? So this is kind of going against like the parenting instinct, I think. You're laughing. Are you the person that's like, let me tell you about Martin Luther King?
Yeah.
This is why we can't have nice things.
No, but because I think that those two things can coexist. So I'm the parent who will say, well, here's what he also did. Because I think, and I think also coming from it, because what I am fundamentally is a storyteller. And I think that to be human is to be flawed. And I find that worthwhile. I'm very suspicious of perfection. I'm very suspicious of, when people tell stories and everything is excessively happy, I just don't believe it. because, but at the same time, I like happiness, but not the kind that's, and so when I write about not turning the oppressed into saints, it's just to say that women do not have to be perfect in order to have justice and dignity. And in some ways, it's, to use an example, so when a woman is raped, I am just often horrified at how quickly people are, in talking about it, to tell us things like, oh, she just had one boyfriend her whole life.
The conditions.
Yes.
The fine print.
And I'm just thinking, who the fuck cares? Of controlling women and their bodies, because it shouldn't matter at all, right? But we constantly do it. We do it with race in this country as well. So, if you want to shoot a black boy and get away with it, well, make sure you find one who smoked some marijuana. Because when you shoot him, you can then talk about, oh, well, he had marijuana in his system. And somehow the underlying assumption being, well, or as I remember one of the media coverage of, I think it was Trayvon Martin, and somebody said, well, he was no angel. And I just found that so dehumanizing. So for me, we should focus on the justice that's done, not on the life of the person, because these things are so subjective. I mean, what one person considers to be a virtuous life might to another person just be a boring life. So it's so important, I think, that we not, in telling a child, for example, well, women have been deprived of that, or women have been deprived of that, it's okay to stop there. We don't have to turn around and then say, oh, these women were so good and kind. And, no, they're human, they're normal, they're flawed, and that's fine.
Now, we're going to have some time for questions. And I want to leave a lot of time for questions since we have 2 microphones. So as you guys are formulating your questions, I'm going to ask one more to give you time to come to the microphones. One thing coming to this conversation, I just thought, on the internet, there's like a feminist writing industrial complex. Like, there's so many think pieces that at times you feel like, oh my God, we're really dissecting this. At this point, do you feel like you're a part of a movement that is in the midst of healthy debate?
No.
That was my cheerful enter, so go to the mics.
I think that there's some progress, and I think there's still so much work to be done. So maybe there are many think pieces, and this is how you know that I don't even know that, because I don't actually go looking for think pieces on feminism.
Well, you're in a Beyonce song, so.
Well,
some of us don't have to Google. No, I understand.
no, but for me, it's still just more looking at what's happening. So in this country, the idea that a woman's right to decide what to do to her with her body, that is tenuous now, to me is incredible. That a woman ran for president and in many ways it became a referendum on her likability is ridiculous to me. So those are the things I look at to gauge how we're doing feminism, rather than how many think pieces somebody's writing. I look at how many women are in positions of power in the American government. I look at how normal that is, and it isn't. Those things trouble me. So, I'd rather sort of vent about them than read think pieces.
Okay.
So my question is, do you think there will be a second Biafran war?
Huh. No. Are you studying Nigeria? That question just came up.
Sorry, my partner wanted me to ask.
Is your partner studying? I mean, why? But I know, but there is a there's a neo-Biafran movement right now, and there are people who talk about Biafra and wanting Biafra to happen. And my position is that I think their views are valid. In other words, there's a lot of discontent in Nigeria. I don't think the answer is secession, and I don't think it's going to happen. However, because I'm Nigerian, I've also learned never to say never to anything.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much both of you ladies for being here. I feel, and like everyone else in the room, so inspired. One of the challenges that I find that I think both of you can speak to is as a storyteller, there's this desire to tell the story that you see of the world, but you also need to keep your audience in mind. And as a feminist, it's very easy to get comfortable with your tribe and to talk to people who are like, yeah, we need to fight injustice. And then you have this huge gap, and we really see it in America right now, where you have this divide, and it's whiteness. So I would like to hear from you. What do you think are the most powerful tools, both as storyteller and as powerful leaders, to bridge that gap and make sure that their stories are heard, that their voices are heard, and that they connect to the stories that we are telling on this side of the bridge?
You know, I think maybe what I can say is what I say to my students when I teach writing, which is tell the truth. I mean, I know it sounds a bit obvious, but I say that because sometimes when we, I think you should. So often people are told, write what you know. But what I would say is don't write what you don't know. I think that we also shouldn't expect one person to speak for everyone. I don't think, for example, that, for me it's about getting more voices in and getting more people on the stage instead of saying, how do I tell the story to somehow speak to every single person? Because it might not, and that's fine. I also think that there's some people you're never going to reach, and you have to make peace with that. You just have to. But for me, like, because feminism is about human rights and it's about justice, I find it to be, I insist that feminism is universal. And because it is universal, it's possible. It's possible if you want to tell a story to illustrate the need for feminism or something. I think just telling the truth of women's experiences and being careful not to turn the women into saints, right? Just making them human and flawed with desires and with hopes and dreams, because women are human, hey? And I guess I'm generally optimistic about the world. I think that there are more people in the world who are willing to have that human connection than not. So really, I'm not as distraught as many people on the left are about, those people. So sometimes I think that voting for an unhinged man doesn't mean you don't have other redeeming qualities, right?
Chimamanda, now that you said that, my goal in life is to write a think piece that you are going to want to read. So I want to speak to two things. One is that you mentioned sons. I have two, an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old. And the 11-year-old chose as his topic for this big 5th grade project, gender equality. So I think I've done my job. As to likability, I'm half Ethiopian and half Mexican, and everybody thinks I'm crazy. But good crazy like a fox. And I take up so much space that people are like, whoa, girl, what's going on? And I'm like, listen, if you don't like the fact that I take up space, that's your problem, not my problem. But for you, one of the things I love about you, besides all your great books, which Ndidi gave me the copy of Half of the Yellow Sun. I don't know if you know Ndidi. Ndidi Uneli? Yeah, anyway. I heard you on NPR, and you said, when Nigeria was coming down hard, or maybe it was the religious leaders coming down hard on the question of homosexuality, and you were appalled by that, and you said that maybe a cousin or somebody called you up and said, "You are no longer my friend," and you said, "I don't need you to be my friend." And I thought that was great, because life is not a popularity contest, and you don't have to try to please everybody. In fact, you don't have to try to please anyone except yourself. So the likability thing, not in my house.
Hello. Good evening. Thank you for all your writings and your words. I know you don't do them for me, but they have influenced my views of what the feminist movement is. And I heard what you said earlier about accepting differences and noting differences and how those don't invalidate a person's life. I also happen to be a Black transgender man, so I do get that my life is not the life of men who were born in the sign of birth. And my role in the feminist movement has changed post-transition. So I guess my question is, while we acknowledge these differences, what is the role of trans women in the feminist movement, if they have one?
Of course they have one. Their role is to the same role that women born female have, which is we need to have conversations about the things. So for example, there's a particular violence that trans women are subject to, that women born female are not. And we need to talk about, we need to find ways to really to stop that. And so here's an example of what I mean, which is to say, if we don't acknowledge differences, then it's harder to talk about it, because it's the reality that, you know, that there's a violence that they are that they're at risk of, right? And so I think that all women have the same role in feminism, which is we need to talk. We need to talk about. I mean, I think of feminism as the acknowledgement that gender is a problem and we need to do something about it. Right? So what I would say is really, it's the same role that women born female have. I don't think anybody, I mean, I don't think I really genuinely don't think that anybody has a more important voice, right? And because the whole point of feminism is that I think that the broader and the wider the stage is, the better. Because in the end, I would want a world where really gender would be irrelevant. Right? That's fundamental, that's my dream. And for that to happen, and that's also why I want that idea of the gender binary, I'm not crazy about.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm a second grade teacher, and often I find myself in a role where I want to teach about oppression, but I also don't want to be in the role of saying this one group has supported so much, kind of talking about immortalizing the oppressed. And so we talk about rising to the ashes. What advice do you have for someone like me who's trying to teach about these things, but also trying not to show the world in such a negative way? Does that make sense? I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't want to teach a single story. And how do I not teach a single story in such a short school day and in a way that is respectful to everyone?
Oh, I wish I knew. It's hard, isn't it? I mean,
I do it like 10 times a day, every day. I don't know what to tell you. You just get up and try and do it again. A little bit better the next time.
Did you say depression?
No, oppression.
Oh, oppression.
Yes.
Oh, right. Oh, I wanted to talk about depression, but anyway. Yeah, I think it's hard, but and this is generally, because something is hard is not a reason to stop doing it. I really believe in trying, and I believe in incremental progress. And you know, you sort of try and you try again. Because fundamentally it's important to teach about oppression. So, you know, you just, you do what you can, I think. And you're brave to, you know, something to keep in mind, right, when you're sort of losing it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Isa. Context for this question, I'm originally from Pakistan, so just there. And I had to write down some thoughts because I had a lot of them. But I remember when I read Americana for the first time, I was in Islamabad and I was in the metro going to work, and chapter 29 says, no, because this is genius, by the way. Because you talk about the oppressive lethargy of choicelessness. And there's a phrase not a phrase, but part of the sentence that says, the real life happens in that somewhere else. Which, I swear to God, I had to get off and be like, hold on, somebody said it. Because that's, as someone who was educated here, but then my whole family lives there, it's a weird thing we live in, where you are constantly trying to explain one culture to the other side. And this weird space that we inhabit in the middle of two. Did you ever have to overcome that in your writing? Because I, as a storyteller, find it very, very, very difficult to authentically say, yes, I'm part of both. Because that's what it feels like to me, but not to people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but it's not about people. It's because it's the truth of your experience. And you know what I find? I find that kind of gray area in between is it's, at least for me, this is what I like to tell myself, especially when my writing is not going well, that it's actually part of it's good for your art. It's because there's a sense in which art doesn't thrive in certainty. So if you have everything is all set in stone, art doesn't thrive in those spaces. Art thrives in the spaces that are grey and that are, slightly squishy, not that firm. And I think to live between two walls is to inhabit that space, and that actually it's wonderful material to mine for storytelling. And the other thing I tell my students when I teach writing, especially, and most of my students are either Nigerian or from the continent of Africa, is I say to them, forget your parents, forget your uncle, your aunties, your cousins, your grandmother, your grandfather, because if you don't, you are going to self-censor. And you won't know when you do it. If you're writing and you're thinking about uncle so-and-so and auntie so-and-so, you are going to self-censor. And I think there's a sense in which you talked about what your truth is. You belong to both. But people on either side are saying to you, choose one. And then there's you're thinking, maybe you should choose one, which should I choose? Well, you shouldn't. And neither should your storytelling.
Thanks for coming today. So my question is two parts. You spoke earlier about defending your distinction between the experiences of trans women and cis women. My original question was, what can we learn from this distinction that's valuable? Why are we making this distinction when it can actually be harmful to very many people? You partially answered it by mentioning a particular type of violence faced by trans women, specifically trans women of color, who are murdered at a rate much higher than any other group of people, any other group of women in America. What's dangerous is that many people are taking your comments of this distinction as validation of this sort of insidious type of politically correct, exclusion. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that. What is the value of making that distinction between the experiences of cis women and trans women, but not including the experience of trans women as the experience of women?
But that's not what I said.
So I guess the piece that people are taking it as saying, making the distinction between the experience of a trans woman growing up being misgendered as, a small girl growing up being gendered as a boy incorrectly, right? That's an experience of a woman. But making that experience separate from the experience of a young girl born incorrectly gendered, what do we learn from that experience?
But I'm sorry, are you suggesting that the experiences are the same?
I'm I'm not suggesting that the experiences are the same. I'm suggesting that both of those experiences are the experiences of women.
Right, but I agree that they are. But are you suggesting that they're the same?
I'm not suggesting that they're the same. I'm just suggesting that they both belong in a category of experiences of women. But some people are taking our comments to be sort of this validation of an exclusion of the experiences of trans women as the experiences of women. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that.
But that's not, like I said earlier, I really think it's about language. If I had used the word CIS, which is not part of my vocabulary, we would not be having this conversation. Trans women are women, obviously. The reason it was important for me to say, and I do think it's important to make a distinction, and you mentioned something which is, for example, that trans women are, that there's the particular sort of terrible forms of violence that trans women are subject to in a way that women, born female, are not. So that's a reason to acknowledge the differences. But even just talking about things like public policy, or talking about things like sports, for example, right? So when there's a raging debate about somebody who has gone through puberty as a boy, and we live in a society that has made a distinction between male sports and female sports, right? So if somebody who has gone through puberty as a boy and transitions, and then wants to participate in women's sports, and somebody sort of says, no, you can't, is that a conversation we can have? Because if we don't acknowledge the differences, then how can we have that conversation? Teachers will tell you about same-sex education. And so in this school, apparently, it's also a thing that's becoming a thing, where they say, if you segregate people by sex, they learn better. It's not my favorite, clearly I'm not a fan of this, right? But apparently studies have shown that it works. If we're going to have that conversation about same-sex schools, right, shouldn't we then, these are the issues that acknowledging the differences in experience can add to the conversation. Actually, I think that it would be a reason to say, maybe we should rethink this idea of same-sex education, for example, right, if we acknowledge these differences.
Absolutely, and I agree with you, and I think that acknowledging the differences is really important. But what I'm saying is that, can you speak to people grasping on to that acknowledgement of difference as a justification for exclusion? Because that's where the danger comes in.
But you know, I don't think, but when you say this, because I think the vitriol is coming from members of my tribe, and I don't think that members of my tribe actually believe in this exclusion. So the crazies who believe in things of that sort, I don't think much care about what I said. I just think I think there's a sense in which, like I said, this is fundamentally about language orthodoxy. And, there's a part of me that just resists this sort of thing, because I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's helpful to insist that unless you use the exact language I want you to use, I will not listen to what you're saying. Because from the very beginning, I think it's been quite clear that there's no way I could possibly say that trans women are not women. It's the sort of thing to me that's obvious, right? So I start from that obvious premise that of course they are women, but in talking about feminism and gender and all of that, it's important for us to acknowledge the differences in experience of gender. That's really what my point is. And I want to go back from this and talk about other things now.
Thank you for such an interesting and thought-provoking discussion tonight. I had a question about what you had talked about before, about likability, and I believe Audie had mentioned the idea of fear of retaliation. And I was just wondering if you had any advice or suggestions about how we can talk to people about some of these issues without, in my personal experience, I felt that sometimes ego can be a roadblock to having a conversation. So what are some tools we can use to have conversations with people without being accusatory, and knowing that perhaps the male ego is something that can't be avoided when talking about gender and feminism. Thank you.
It's interesting to me that...
Yeah, everything in your sentence now.
No, but what I was struck by is how, and I think this is how being, what gender does, is that I don't know how many men would want to learn how to talk about things without being accusatory, and I mean, there's a sense, it's that burden of being female, which is you've been socialized to think about, being nice, how do we circumvent the male ego? We don't, we just smash it. It's also part of likability that so many of us are conditioned to accommodate the male ego, and I just don't have patience for that. I think, and there's going to be pushback, and there are people you won't reach, but it's not a woman's place to contort herself to fit in the mass of the male ego. It's not. A woman is fully human, and it wouldn't be such a problem if men were socialized also to deal with women's egos, but they're not.
I want to note here, Wise, a friend of mine at work, once told me that I don't have a constitutional right to be liked, and that was very freeing for some reason. Because she, essentially was the idea like, yeah, someone's not going to like you. The end. And a lot of, check your Tinder, right? Some people don't care. They win you over. And you're really trying to get to that place.
Well, that's so well said, but here's the thing though about
Tinder didn't come up in the book? They're not right to the end?
No, but anyway. It is true, right? It is true, but I think it's also important to teach girls that they're not just objects to be liked or disliked. They are subjects who can also like and dislike. So this idea that we have to change ourselves to somebody who like us, right? We can also choose not to like that person. I would often say to my nieces, and they'd be like, oh, when they were younger, they'd be like, oh, this boy doesn't like me. And I'm thinking, yeah, but you can also choose not to like him.
This is also talked about by people who you describe as using feminism light to say, well, women have all the power. You decide whether to say yes or no, so therefore it's power done. Yes. I think that language escapes from you very quickly.
Yes.
You didn't feel that power?
No. Because here's the thing, it's not power. That whole thing is just such nonsense. It's not power. It's the same way you're told, you can control the man. You just need to do the right way. And I'm thinking, I'd rather have that power than have somebody try and control me. I don't want to be the person trying to control somebody who has power. And there's something about it as well that I find it quite dishonest, because often people will use it to shut down debate about, so they'll say things like, oh, I have a friend, and I use that in the book where he said, oh, my father is supposed to be in charge at home, but really it's my mother who's in charge behind the scenes. And my thing is, well, if she's really in charge, why does it have to be behind the scenes? Which really makes the point about, gender, because if we were comfortable with women being in power, then she wouldn't have to be behind the scenes.
We're just going to take 3 more questions.
Hi, good evening, Ms. Adichie. It's such a pleasure to see you speak tonight. I think you're a really important and splendid voice in literature and contemporary feminism, and I've only read a small portion of your work, but I'm so eager to read more. And I wanted to address, and just now I wanted to speak to what you said about exploring the differences, and I was so happy to hear you talk about exploring the important difference of trans women's experiences in terms of experiencing different types of violence. So that's really important, and glad to hear you say it. I want to also talk about something you wrote a few days ago when you said that trans women had male privilege. It made me, I'm thinking of Laverne Cox's response, and also that of my best friend growing up who is a trans woman. Laverne Cox wrote about, and my friend experienced, being shamed and punished for being feminine and being forced to assume male roles. And I wanted to put forth the perspective that I think obviously they were both shaped by male socialization, but this treatment that that caused so much suffering for them and for many other trans women is not in fact a form of privilege. So I wanted to ask you to consider that perspective, and I put this forward because I think you're important, and I hope you can recognize a little more nuance in why people have exhibited outrage in the past week. Thank you.
Thank you. And you know, I think sometimes the understanding of male privilege can be, it's similar to when people talk about white privilege, and sometimes white people say, well, I had such a hard time, what do you mean? So in saying male privilege, it's not at all to discount, and I have read and heard and listened to just really painful personal experiences of people born in bodies that are not theirs, right? But at the same time, because gender, I mean, my point was that gender is about how the world treats you. So if, for example, that child, and I think in some ways gay men can also speak to sort of that idea of having horrible pressures put on you because you're a boy, but you're not a boy in the way we want you to be a boy, right? But, so let's use my culture as an example. The point I was making is, that boy who's feminine and who has a lot of, a lot of just negative pressure put on him still gets to break the collar knot. And it still is something that the person born female doesn't have access to. So that's what I mean. It's not at all to diminish suffering, right? It's not at all to suggest that these people haven't gone through just really painful experiences. It's not that, but it's to say, because I think that if we are to talk about male privilege as something that exists in the world, then we can't, so we talk about male privilege knowing that even men who live in the world and occupy space, that they experience it in different ways. Well, that privilege is it's sort of like the voice of God when you go to a play or something, right? It's there, and it's something that, it's a privilege that it's handed out to people. How people experience it is always individual, and there are differences. But I think it's important to, because if that's the case, then when we talk about male privilege and dismantling male privilege, because the only reason we're talking about male privilege is to say that in all societies around the world, we need to dismantle it. We need to end it. We need to end that idea that if you're born with a certain body part, then you have access in ways that other people don't. If we're going to talk about male privilege, I think that saying, well, because I had a lot of pressure and I had a lot of suffering, therefore I did not have male privilege, in some way then, it becomes difficult to talk about male privilege as something that exists in the world, right? Because of course, when we talk about various forms of oppression, there are always individual differences. But again, the point remains that child, because the world looks at that child as a boy, that's really the thing, the world looks at that child as a boy, and therefore the world is going to let that child break the collar knot. The world is not going to marry that child off at 11 when that child's period starts. The world, I mean, that's what I mean.
I still worry about tying that position of predicament to male identity, but I think, thank you for hearing me out.
Well, thank you. I know this is random, but can we just finish this? I do want to hear from you. So when you say you worry about tying it to male identity, tell me what you mean.
I completely agree that that there are advantages to being seen as a male even when you are not, and so I agree with that you will not be married off at 11, as you say. I prefer the term male socialization as in the outside world socializing the child to be male rather than male privilege, because I worry that implies that person is male in some way. And I worry about, I guess, hurting someone's feeling, but I appreciate the nuance you have given me, even if I have a different preference for language.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, we'll make this go on for a bit longer, so can we take, I'll be very quick, can we take the rest of the questions? Because that went on for longer than...
Sure. My question, hi, my name is Portia, and this is actually a question for both of you. This has to do with race and feminism, and we both had comments earlier on about race and feminism, you said that you can't, not be a woman in black, and you also mentioned you were surprised at the turnout that you saw here, and I also was surprised.
She didn't tell us why. We need to ask Audie to tell us
That's why it works, really.
Right, you didn't say it, but I got it, and I'm sure that others here got it too. So my question is, how do you, my question is on intersectionality. Like, how do you, what are your thoughts on intersectionality and how it informs feminism from white women versus black women, from those two perspectives?
That's for you.
You're doing so well. I feel like I'm too old for this conversation. Not that I'm above it all, but just I feel like this is something that has come after me. I'm like a tail end Gen X, higher learning Spike Lee type of person, where if you just showed up at the Black Student Union, you were like, I got thoughts, that was the extent of it. Now, the fact that you can have this conversation, that somebody could have a national march, and you can be like, hold up, who's at the front of the march? I went to the Million Woman March. That's where we went, you know what I mean? There was not this idea that you were going to force a conversation to happen. So I look at it, with a lot of joy and just sort of excitement that I think it's a sign of a movement maturing, and it may not feel good because, when you are growing, things don't always feel good, but it's necessary, and I'm glad it's happening. It's similar with the conversation of allyship, right? It just seems really complex and fraught, and microaggressions feels complex and fraught because unlike past generations, which were fighting for systemic change, right? We are going to change the system because I can't deal with the guy behind the counter, so I got the government to come in and let me sit at the counter. You guys want the guy at the counter to think about how he's treating you. That is a very complex kind of interaction you're trying to have and change you're trying to make. And God love you for doing it. I'm right there to report live. I'm a bystander.
I think Audie said it all. Actually, what I wanted to say is, I want you to ask that question without speaking of language. I just feel that, even the word intersectionality comes from a certain kind of academic discourse that sometimes I don't even know what it means. So to talk about intersectionality, I don't even know what it means.
So when I heard your comments earlier and I saw the crowd here, even me as a black woman, I participated in the Women's March in January, but I also had some reservations about it because I'll speak for myself, having an issue with white women kind of, now that it's a thing for them, now it's a big thing. You know what I mean? Not to put anybody's experience down, but a lot of the things that are just becoming aware of some people, I've been dealing with all of my life. So although I thought it was great, I participated, it was wonderful, I'm glad I did, but there was still a lot of hesitation on my part, and I know a lot of my friends who actually didn't participate because of those same kind of struggles. So I was just wondering what the two of you, I know you have a different experience because you were born in Nigeria and you spend your time part ways. So it's been something that's been kind of on my mind, and I wondered what you had to say.
Just listening to you made me think about it. It's sort of like those women's magazines that sometimes they're like, the new style for summer is the braid, and then there's a white woman with a lady braid. And you're looking and you're thinking, that's not how to braid. I feel like we've been doing this for 2,000 years. It's not the new style for summer. But, and I hear you, because I understand, I have African American friends who even the word feminist they have trouble with because of its history. And I completely understand that and respect that, right? And empathize. I think had I been born in the US, my sense is I would feel the same way. I'm not even sure I would necessarily embrace the word as I have done. But I also think that for me, it's the idea that we need a word, right? We need a word to rally around. And I think that the history of Western feminism is one that is fraught with racism. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And at the same time, to say that feminism is not the Western invention. That my great-grandmother in what is now southeastern Nigeria was feminist. She didn't know the word. She, didn't know the Pankhurst women, but she was feminist. And maybe if we start to think of feminism in that way, right, to think of feminism not being a Western invention, maybe, and I don't know, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but maybe the sting of its history might be, I don't know, maybe I'm preaching, I think I'm preaching. But to talk about, here's what I think, again, that idea of having many voices, can I just digress and just tell a random story about the Netherlands? I remember I went to Amsterdam and I went and met with Dutch feminists. And what I was struck by was how all the Dutch women of color said that this was sort of the sort of mainstream feminist institute. And they said, we never get to come here. The only reason we're here is because you're here. And I thought, in 2016, really? So, I think it's a thing. It's a thing that we just need to keep doing something about, right? But maybe the first step is acknowledging that it's a thing. Because sometimes I feel that, and it's also why I'm kind of a bit wary about this sort of magical sisterhood. Maybe we don't need to have a magical sisterhood, right? Maybe, no, but this is true. There are things that, whatever color you are, if you're a woman, you deal with, right? There are other things that if you're a woman and a certain color, you deal with, and if you're a woman and a certain, you don't. And I think it's okay to sort of, make room for both, without insisting, well, I'm going to go back again and sound like this record about differences, so I'll just move on. Differences is a good thing.
One quick coda to that, I would say that everywhere I've ever been, I've pushed my way into the room. Otherwise, it just wouldn't happen. So maybe for your friends, they decided that march wasn't for them and they chose another battle, so to speak. Don't second guess your choice. Do you know what I mean? Because everywhere we go, it is a meaningful step, given the history of the country in a lot of ways.
And I'm glad I went, and I'm actually glad that I do see so many different faces here, but I think that having an artist like you come, this wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. Like all these faces, these different colored faces wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. So I think it is progress of some sort. Can we just give it up for this?
Hi, Chimamanda. My name is Wilsar. I'm actually from Sierra Leone, and I have been in this country for more than half my life. I left Sierra Leone in 1999 during the war. So I read Americana, and I loved it. Actually, made me miss home. And I was wondering, the first question, is there a movie coming out?
You would have to direct that question to Lupita Nyong'o. Lupita has the rights, and I think it's I don't really know the details. But there's supposed to be, yes. And she's going to be fantastic if I know. Yeah.
And second is, so when I read your book, I'm also watching African City, which is a web series that is written by a Ghanaian woman, and it's set in Accra. And so it gives me nostalgia. It makes me miss home. I miss Sierra Leone. I want to pack my bags and take my book right back to Sierra Leone. And I want to ask you, what advice do you have for returning to go back and live in this world, this space for quite a long time? And what should they expect? What advice do you have for also going back with the blind? Because I haven't.
Well, the first thing you have to do before you leave is make sure that Sierra Leone is not on the travel ban list. Now, having heard that, I would say, listen, I find that there's a kind of, we've been abroad, we have all the answers to all the problems in Africa. And it's not a very useful way to, so I would say, I don't think you have all the answers, and America is not Africa, and I think listening is a good way to start. Just listening and relearning and because when you leave home, home doesn't wait for you. Home changes, and when you go back, I think there's a sense in which you sort of, there's a certain kind of humility in accepting that you have to relearn what things are like. But it's, I would say it's just really, there's a lot going on in West Africa, and it's worth going back to be part of things. Thanks.
I watch a movie.
So am I.
Hi, Chimamanda. I will try and make this quick. But you mentioned that in the ideal world, gender will hopefully be irrelevant, or at least gender discrimination, inequality, whatever language you want to give to it. But in the meantime, how do you think that we can and should expand women's opportunities, those who identify as all of the different ways of women? How should we expand and allow women to inhabit spaces where historically and still currently those spaces have been closed off from women, while also recognizing that, sort of similar to what a prior questioner had asked, that gender is not the only thing that blocks people from opportunities. Specifically, I'm thinking of race. So what would you suggest? How do you think? Not as you know all and I want to take everything that you say, but just as a person.
What do you mean you don't?
I mean, I do. I don't want to put the pressure on you, but just as a person.
I would say to what Audie said, which is push your way in. I think more women need to do that. I mean, I guess maybe the question is, how do we remember that not every woman is white?
Yeah.
You just bloody remember, right? I mean, it just happens. It's not. It should be. In some ways, it's kind of like the political discourse in this country, which has always struck me when they say things like, "Women voted for so and so, and black people voted for so and so," and I'm just thinking, wait, hold on, where do I fit in? That assumption that in political discourse in America, women actually means white women, and there's a problem with that. How do we? So I think people whose jobs in the media can start. I don't believe that Audie would ever say that. Can start by just challenging language matters, and I really just think that white women need to just wake up every day and say, not all women are white, 3 times in front of the mirror. And do a few stretches. Black, brown, all kinds of women.
Very quickly, that is something we talk about in the newsroom. That comes up, and the number of times that I'm doing a news story where the person is black and I just try and do the story without saying they're black, and then the editor will say, well, I think we're missing some adjectives here. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, I have to play dumb for like 10 minutes. Like, oh, no, I don't think we need it. Because what they're trying to say is like, how will our audience be able to judge this person if we don't insert all the baggage in? What's wrong with you? And similarly, when we have the conversation, say, about evangelical voters, you know, I always say white evangelical voters, right? I mean, there are huge populations of like Latino and Black evangelicals out there, but like, again, it's that way of that political shorthand. It is really hard to please. I'm not saying we're doing a good job, but I'm saying it is something that people are thinking.
I think NPR is doing better than most. I think it's fair.
Just being nice. It's rough. There's some days where I'm like, please don't really be extra right now.
It's similar to working class, which I've actually felt really annoyed about. All of the talk around the current president of the United States, and all of the talk about the working class voted for him. And I'm thinking, I know many, many black people who are working class, whose economic circumstances are difficult, who did not vote for him. And where is that from? Where is that from? I think it then makes you question the idea that, and I suppose I don't want to talk about the election, but I suppose it's a question of how much are you willing to overlook to vote for what seems to be your, I don't know, economic circumstances, but please.
Thank you. I know the premise of this book is a request from a female friend for how to raise a daughter. My question is, what is your view or advice on how to make this a shared responsibility? I know you touch on it in one 13 or 12 or something about the male role. But I think a lot of this is about the burden of being female. Mm-hmm. And so much of the responsibility ends up falling on the woman, on the mother. Now, a lot has been said about women in a way are responsible for the state of gender relations in many of our societies, because it's women who raise children, women who socialize children, boys, girls, women who reinforce some of these gender roles. Maybe an unfair statement to make, but I think there is a gem of truth in it in some societies. So how do we move from making this the responsibility solely of the mother or the female or the females in a child's life to getting more male responsibility, talking about the masculine, the male role? And I ask this from a very personal perspective of having just become a grandmother. My son's daughter, and we're all rallying around how to make her a strong, woman, but make the men play an active role as well. So what are your views?
I think the premise of this book really is that men have to be, it's not even a question of men have to be part of it. My view on feminism is that it's a conversation not just for women, it's a conversation for women and men, because women inhabit the world with men, and I do think it's unfair to say that women are somehow responsible. Because I think the question to ask is, if women live in a world that is steeped in misogyny and patriarchy, forgive the jargon for once, the question I think we should be asking is who's benefiting? So yes, women socialize and we socialize girls to strength and boys to, but in the end, who's benefiting? It's not women. So I feel that it's unfair to then somehow blame women. It's always blaming the victim. I have a friend, an American friend, who said to me, she's progressive, her husband is progressive, they're both feminists, and she said to me that what she found interesting was that their son, her husband still exhibited the lack of patience if their son was too soft. So if he cried about certain things, her husband was very short with him. And he's a man who's ostensibly feminist. It's hard, I think, but maybe for me one way to start is by not praising men for doing what they should do. I think there's that idea that we say, oh, he's such a good father, and he had the baby, and we're like, oh, how wonderful. I really don't believe in that, because I think what it does is it reinforces that idea that you're doing something extraordinary for which you deserve praise, and you don't deserve praise for raising your child. It's your child. I think the best thing is this company, look at the commercials on television. Every commercial about cleaning, and it's women all the time. Why? Right? And so my thing is, the idea that domestic work is still sort of a female enterprise is so mainstream in this country. We need to start pushing back. Because, and the reason it's important is that I think it's the central theme in that debate about can a woman have it all. When we talk about that, what we're really saying is domestic work is what the woman does. Raising the child is what she does. Now, can she have it all? Can she then take on the additional thing of walking outside the home? And if she does, yay. And I'm thinking, no, let's question the premise. We shouldn't be having this conversation if we didn't think that domestic work was something a woman alone should do. And I think in many, many homes today, and I don't care how progressive they are, it's the woman who's doing the burden of the domestic work. And, and so there's a part in the book where I say to my friend, it doesn't matter if he doesn't wipe the baby's butt as perfectly as you will, because, the baby won't die. The baby will be fine. My point being that some women say things like, oh, I just cleaned it because, he said he doesn't know how to clean. No, don't clean it. And there's a lovely story, I think this is from Gloria Steinem's memoir, where a woman is saying, oh, I feel kind of guilty about sharing domestic work with my husband. And another woman says to her, now imagine you're sharing your house with a woman. How would you divide the domestic work? Now do it that way. Right? So the idea being that it's doable, and I think we should approach it with a certain kind of ordinariness, because that's the way to make it ordinary. And maybe we should write letters to all of those companies that advertise cleaning detergents and have them bloody put men in some of their commercials. And I think the last thing, I also think that, back to that idea of women being responsible, I think in teaching, we need to teach boys to be vulnerable. I think it's so important. We need to teach boys that crying is not just okay, it's a good thing. We need to teach male vulnerability has to be something that we make mainstream. But going back there, we also need to teach girls that it's okay for boys to cry. And I say that because there's still many women who, although they sort of profess equality and all of that, they still really want the man not to cry and to be always strong and always, and somehow I find that dehumanizing as well for men. So I think that in sort of that idea of women being responsible, I don't think they are, that when we're teaching boys to be vulnerable, we need to teach girls that it's perfectly normal and ordinary that boys be vulnerable.